My name is Susan, and I'm 57 years old. Last month, I watched my daughter Emma walk down the aisle in her beautiful white wedding dress, and I said absolutely nothing about the $95 million private islands that were left to me 3 years ago. I kept that secret locked away in my heart as she promised to love and honor a man I was already starting to doubt. You see, sometimes the greatest act of love is staying silent, even when you're holding the key to someone's entire future. But what happened just 1 week after their honeymoon made me realize that my silence might have been the smartest decision I ever made. Before we dive into this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Please hit that like button if you've ever had to keep a difficult secret to protect someone you love, and don't forget to subscribe, because I'm about to share why a mother would hide such incredible wealth from her own daughter. Let me take you back to the beginning to help you understand how I ended up in this impossible situation. When I was 22, I married Robert, a kind and hardworking man who worked as a loan officer at our local bank in Hartford, Connecticut. We weren't wealthy by any stretch of the imagination, but we had something much more valuable than money. We had genuine love and respect for each other. Robert came from a small family. His parents had passed away when he was in college, and he only had one sibling, an older brother named William who lived somewhere up north. William had always been the mysterious one in the family. Robert rarely talked about him, and in all our years together, I think I only met William twice at family gatherings. He seemed like a distant, serious man who dressed in expensive suits and spoke very little. Robert mentioned that William had done well for himself in real estate, but we never knew the true extent of his success. When Emma was born, our little family felt complete. I was 23 then, working part-time at a small insurance office, while Robert continued his steady job at the bank. We lived in a modest 3-bedroom house with a white picket fence that Robert had painted himself every 2 years without fail. Our life was simple, but filled with Sunday morning pancakes, family movie nights, and Emma's dance recitals that Robert never missed. Money was always tight, but we made it work. I remember clipping coupons every Sunday and shopping for Emma's school clothes at discount stores. Robert would joke that we were rich in love but poor in everything else, and we'd laugh about it over our nightly cup of coffee after Emma went to bed. Those were some of the happiest years of my life. Everything changed when Emma was 15. Robert had just turned 42 and seemed to be in perfect health. He'd been complaining of some chest tightness for a few days, but being the stubborn man he was, he insisted it was just stress from work. On a Tuesday morning in March, while Emma was getting ready for school, Robert collapsed in our kitchen. The paramedics said it was a massive heart attack. He was gone before we even reached the hospital. The years that followed were a blur of grief, single parenthood, and financial struggle. Life insurance helped with the immediate expenses, but raising a teenager on my own while working full-time was incredibly challenging. Emma was devastated by her father's death, but she channeled her grief into her studies. She became even more determined to succeed academically, knowing that a scholarship would be her only path to college. I took on extra hours at the insurance office and eventually worked my way up to a supervisor position. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills and gave us health insurance. Emma and I grew incredibly close during those years. We were a team supporting each other through everything. She worried constantly about our financial situation and would often suggest getting a part-time job to help out, but I insisted that her education was more important than anything else. When Emma graduated as valedictorian and received a full scholarship to Boston University, I cried tears of joy and relief. My daughter was going to have opportunities that Robert and I could never have given her through our own means. She was smart, determined, and completely oblivious to the fact that our lives were about to change in the most unexpected way imaginable. 3 years ago, on a rainy Thursday afternoon in October, I received a phone call that turned my entire world upside down. The caller identified himself as attorney James Morrison from a prestigious law firm in Boston. He asked if I was Susan Patterson, widow of Robert Patterson, and when I confirmed, his voice took on a more formal tone. Mrs. Patterson, I'm calling regarding the estate of William Patterson, who passed away last week at the age of 82. According to his will, you are the sole beneficiary of his entire estate. I nearly dropped the phone. William Robert's mysterious older brother, who we barely knew, had left me everything. I explained to Mr. Morrison that there must be some mistake, that William and I had hardly spoken more than a few words in all the years I'd known him. But the attorney assured me that the will was very specific and legally binding. What came next took my breath away completely. Mr. Morrison began reading from the will. To my sister-in-law, Susan Patterson, who showed my brother Robert more love and kindness than our family ever did, I leave my entire estate. This includes 3 private islands in the Caribbean, currently valued at approximately $95 million, along with all associated properties, investments, and holdings. $95 million. I had to ask him to repeat that number 3 times before it even began to sink in. William had been incredibly wealthy, far beyond anything we had ever imagined. He'd built a real estate empire that included luxury resorts, commercial properties, and these 3 pristine private islands in the Bahamas that he'd purchased decades earlier as investments. The legal process was overwhelming and complicated. I had to travel to Boston multiple times over the next several months, signing documents, meeting with financial advisors, and learning about assets I never knew existed. The islands were currently being managed by a property management company that handled everything from maintenance to the occasional rental to ultra-wealthy clients. During this entire process, I made a decision that surprised even myself. I decided not to tell Emma about the inheritance. My daughter was 25, then working her first real job after college at a marketing firm in New York City. She was finally independent, confident, and building her own life based on her own merits and hard work. I was terrified that sudden wealth would change her. I'd watched enough news stories and read enough articles about lottery winners and inheritance recipients whose lives fell apart because they couldn't handle the psychological impact of sudden wealth. Emma had grown up understanding the value of money because we'd never had much of it. She was grateful, hardworking, and grounded. I didn't want to risk losing that version of my daughter, so I kept the secret. I continued living in our same modest house, driving my same 10-year-old Honda Civic, and working at the insurance office. The only change I made was hiring the management company to continue operating the islands remotely while I figured out what to do long term. Every month, I'd receive reports about the properties and deposits into accounts I'd opened specifically for the estate, but my day-to-day life remained exactly the same. It was lonely, carrying such an enormous secret. There were nights when I'd lie awake thinking about all the things that money could do for Emma and me, but I always came back to the same conclusion. I wanted to wait until Emma was truly mature enough to handle such wealth responsibly. I wanted to see what kind of person she'd become on her own, without the influence of knowing she'd never have to worry about money again. 2 years later, Emma called me with excitement in her voice that I hadn't heard since her college graduation. She'd met someone special at a business conference in Manhattan. His name was Marcus Wellington, and from the way Emma described him, he seemed almost too good to be true. Marcus was 32 years old, 6 feet tall, with dark hair, and what Emma called the most charming smile. He worked as a senior consultant at a large financial advisory firm in the city, specializing in investment strategies for high net worth clients. Emma was completely smitten, and their relationship moved quickly from casual dating to serious commitment. When Emma first brought Marcus home to Connecticut for a weekend visit, I have to admit, I was impressed. He was articulate, well-dressed, and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me. He asked thoughtful questions about Robert and our family history. and he listened attentively when Emma shared stories about growing up. He brought flowers for me and complimented the dinner I'd prepared, showing the kind of manners that spoke well of his upbringing. But as the months went by and their relationship deepened, I began noticing small things that made me uncomfortable. During our conversations, Marcus had a tendency to steer topics toward financial matters. He'd ask seemingly innocent questions about our family's long-term financial planning and whether Robert had left any investment portfolios or trust funds. When I'd explain that we'd always lived paycheck to paycheck, he'd nod sympathetically, but then follow up with suggestions about maximizing asset potential and building generational wealth. Emma didn't seem to notice these patterns, or if she did, she attributed them to Marcus's professional expertise. "He's just naturally focused on financial security," she'd tell me when I gently mentioned his frequent money-related questions. "He wants to make sure we're both thinking about our future responsibly." Marcus also showed an unusual interest in our family home. During one visit, he spent a considerable amount of time walking through each room, commenting on the excellent bones of the house and its potential market value. He suggested that I might want to consider downsizing to something more manageable and investing the proceeds. When I explained that the house held too many memories for me to sell, he seemed genuinely puzzled by my attachment to what he called an underperforming asset. The red flags became more apparent when Marcus began sharing details about his own family background. His parents were both deceased, and he'd been raised primarily by a grandmother who'd passed away during his college years. He spoke about having learned early in life that financial security was the foundation of all other forms of security, and that he'd dedicated his career to helping others achieve true wealth independence. What concerned me most was how he spoke about money in general. There was an intensity in his eyes when he discussed investment opportunities and financial strategies that seemed to go beyond professional interest. During one dinner conversation, he mentioned that he believed everyone has hidden assets they're not maximizing, and that most people don't realize the true value of what they already possess. Despite my growing concerns, I tried to give Marcus the benefit of the doubt. Emma was clearly in love, and she seemed happier than I'd seen her since before her father's death. When Marcus proposed to her with a diamond ring that must have cost several months of his salary, Emma was over the moon with joy. I smiled and congratulated them both, but privately I wondered where a financial consultant had gotten the money for such an expensive purchase. As their engagement period progressed and wedding planning began, I found myself in an increasingly difficult position. Part of me wanted to tell Emma about the inheritance to give her the financial security that would make Marcus's apparent money-focused attention irrelevant. But another part of me felt that this situation was actually providing valuable insight into Marcus's true character and motivations. I decided to wait and see what would happen after they were married. If Marcus truly loved Emma for who she was, then my wealth would remain a non-issue. But if his interest in our family was primarily financial, then keeping the secret might reveal his true nature before Emma got too deeply involved. It was a risky strategy, but I felt it was the best way to protect my daughter from potentially making a mistake that could affect the rest of her life. The morning of Emma's wedding dawned clear and crisp in the hills of Vermont. She'd chosen a small, intimate venue at a historic inn that overlooked a beautiful valley painted in autumn colors. As I stood in my daughter's bridal suite, watching her put the finishing touches on her makeup, I felt a complex mix of emotions that I'd never experienced before. Emma looked absolutely radiant in her wedding dress, a simple but elegant gown with delicate lace sleeves that she'd found at a sample sale in New York. We'd spent months planning this wedding on a modest budget, carefully choosing every detail to make the day special without going into debt. Emma had insisted on paying for half of everything herself, despite my offers to help more significantly. If only she knew that I could have easily afforded to give her the wedding of her dreams at any venue in the world. As I helped her with her veil, I caught my own reflection in the mirror. I was wearing a navy blue dress that I'd purchased from a department store paired with pearls that had belonged to Robert's mother. I looked like exactly what I was supposed to be, the mother of the bride from a middle-class family. Proud, but not wealthy. Supportive, but not extravagant. The ceremony was held in a small chapel adjacent to the inn with about 50 guests in attendance. As I walked down the aisle to take my seat in the front row, I noticed Marcus standing at the altar in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, looking confident and handsome. But even in that moment, I observed how his eyes scanned the small gathering of guests, and I wondered if he was assessing their apparent financial status. When the music began and Emma appeared at the back of the chapel, my heart filled with pride and love. She walked down the aisle with such grace and confidence, and for a moment, all my concerns about Marcus faded away. This was my daughter's moment, and she deserved to feel nothing but joy and love. But as I watched the ceremony unfold, I couldn't help but listen carefully to Marcus's interactions with our guests during the brief mingling time before the official proceedings began. I overheard him asking Emma's college roommate about her career in banking, specifically inquiring about inheritance law procedures and estate planning strategies. When he spoke with my neighbor who owned a small construction business, Marcus steered the conversation toward family wealth transfer and generational asset management. During the ceremony itself, as Emma and Marcus exchanged vows, I found myself saying a silent prayer that I was wrong about my suspicions. I hoped that Marcus's financial focus was simply a product of his profession, and that his love for Emma was genuine and pure. But sitting there in that chapel, holding the secret of $95 million in Caribbean real estate, I also felt a strange sense of power and protection. The reception was held in the inn's main dining room, beautifully decorated with simple centerpieces of seasonal flowers that Emma had arranged herself. I watched my daughter dance with her new husband, laughing and glowing with happiness, and I made a conscious decision to put my concerns aside for the evening. This was Emma's wedding day, and I was determined to let her enjoy every moment of it. But even during the reception, I noticed Marcus continuing to network with guests in ways that seemed unusual for a groom at his own wedding. He spent considerable time talking with Emma's boss about corporate investment strategies and with her uncle about real estate opportunities in emerging markets. When I danced with him during the traditional mother-son dance, he used the opportunity to ask me again about our family's long-term financial planning and whether I'd ever considered diversifying beyond traditional savings accounts. That night, after Emma and Marcus had left for their honeymoon in Hawaii, I drove home alone to my quiet house. Sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea, I reflected on the day and the decision I'd made to keep my secret. Something deep in my gut told me that I'd made the right choice, even though I couldn't yet fully explain why. Time would tell whether Marcus was the man he appeared to be or whether my instincts about his true motivations were correct. Emma and Marcus's honeymoon in Hawaii seemed to be everything they'd hoped for, based on the enthusiastic photos and messages Emma shared with me daily. Pictures of sunset dinners, snorkeling adventures, and romantic walks on the beach filled my phone, and hearing my daughter's voice so full of happiness made me question whether I'd been too suspicious of her new husband. But on their third day away, I received the first phone call from Marcus that made my stomach drop. He called while Emma was at the spa, saying he wanted to have a private conversation about family matters. His tone was different from the casual, friendly demeanor he'd always used with me before. There was a business-like quality to his voice that put me immediately on edge. "Susan," he began, "I've been thinking a lot about your situation living alone in that big house with no real financial security for your future. Emma and I have been discussing it, and we're both concerned about your long-term stability." I assured him that I was managing fine and had adequate savings for my retirement, but Marcus pressed on. He began asking specific questions about Robert's life insurance policy, whether there had been any additional benefits or settlements after his death, and if our family had ever been involved in any kind of trust funds or investment accounts. Over the next few days, these calls became more frequent and more pointed. Marcus wanted to know about the exact value of our house, whether I had any undisclosed assets that Emma might not be aware of, and if there were any family inheritance possibilities that I hadn't mentioned. He framed all of these questions as concern for my welfare and Emma's future security, but the persistence and specificity of his inquiries made me increasingly uncomfortable. On their 5th day in Hawaii, Marcus called with what he presented as a solution to my financial vulnerability. He'd been researching investment opportunities and had identified several high-yield, low-risk options that could significantly improve my financial outlook. He wanted to set up a meeting as soon as they returned so that he could help me make some smart financial decisions for Emma's sake. When Emma called later that same day, her voice was still cheerful, but I noticed she brought up my financial situation in a way she never had before. Mom, Marcus has been explaining some things to me about retirement planning and investment strategies. He thinks you might not be as prepared for the future as you should be. He's offered to help us figure out a better plan for your finances. This concerned me deeply because Emma had never previously worried about my financial situation. I'd always been careful to present myself as financially stable, and she'd been focused on building her own career and life. The fact that Marcus had convinced her to worry about my financial security suggested that he was already beginning to influence her perspective in ways that served his agenda. By the time they returned from their honeymoon, I'd made up my mind to test Marcus's true intentions. I called my attorney in Boston and asked him to research Marcus Wellington's background more thoroughly. I also began preparing myself mentally for what I suspected was coming, a more direct attempt by Marcus to gain access to what he assumed were my family's financial assets. The attorney's preliminary report arrived 2 days before Emma and Marcus returned from Hawaii. Marcus's financial situation was interesting, to say the least. While he did work for a reputable firm and earned a decent salary, his personal spending habits suggested either family money or debt that wasn't immediately apparent. The expensive engagement ring designer clothes and luxury vacation choices didn't align with his documented income level. More concerning was a pattern of previous relationships with women from families of apparent wealth. Marcus had been engaged once before to a woman whose family owned a successful restaurant chain, but that relationship had ended abruptly around the time of her father's bankruptcy. He'd also had a long-term relationship with someone whose family had significant real estate holdings, but that had ended when she'd discovered he'd been researching her family's financial background without her knowledge. Armed with this information, I felt more confident in my decision to maintain my silence about the Caribbean islands and the $95 million inheritance. Marcus was about to reveal his true character, and I wanted Emma to see it clearly before she became too deeply entangled in his schemes. Exactly 1 week after Emma and Marcus returned from their honeymoon, I received the phone call I'd been expecting. Marcus's voice was more businesslike than ever as he informed me that he'd arranged for a family financial consultant to meet with me. He explained that he'd been thinking extensively about my situation and had concluded that I needed professional guidance to protect my assets and ensure Emma's inheritance. "I've scheduled a meeting for this Saturday afternoon," Marcus told me. "Gerald Thornton is one of the best estate planning attorneys in the region, and he's agreed to review your situation and provide some recommendations. Emma and I will be there too, of course, since this affects all of our futures." The presumption in his voice was stunning. He'd taken it upon himself to hire a lawyer for me and schedule a meeting in my own home without asking my permission. When I questioned the necessity of such a meeting, Marcus's tone became slightly impatient. "Susan, you need to think about Emma's future here. What happens if something happens to you? Do you have a will? Do you have your assets properly structured? These are important questions that can't wait any longer." Saturday afternoon arrived, and with it came Marcus and his attorney, Gerald Thornton. Gerald appeared to be in his mid-30s, impeccably dressed in an expensive suit and carrying a leather briefcase that looked like it cost more than most people's monthly rent. He had the kind of polished, aggressive demeanor that I'd learned to associate with people who made their living taking advantage of others' naivety about financial matters. Emma arrived separately, having driven from the city, and I could see immediately that Marcus had spent considerable time preparing her for this meeting. She hugged me warmly, but then said, "Mom, I'm so glad Marcus thought to arrange this. I've been worrying about your future security, and it's important that we get everything organized properly." Gerald began the meeting by spreading various documents across my dining room table and launching into a presentation about estate planning strategies and asset protection protocols. He used impressive-sounding terminology about trusts, tax optimization, and wealth preservation that was clearly designed to make me feel overwhelmed and dependent on his expertise. But the real agenda became clear when Gerald started asking specific questions about my assets. He wanted detailed information about the value of my house, any savings or investment accounts, life insurance policies, and any other family assets that might not be immediately apparent. When I provided basic information about my modest savings and the house, Gerald seemed disappointed but pressed on. Marcus then took over the conversation, explaining that he'd done some research and discovered that my financial situation was more precarious than he'd initially realized. He'd calculated that my current savings wouldn't be sufficient for long-term care if I became ill, and that my death would leave Emma with significant financial responsibilities. "That's why we need to restructure everything now," Marcus said, gesturing toward Gerald's documents. "We need to establish a family trust with Emma and me as co-trustees, transfer the house into the trust for tax purposes, and set up power of attorney arrangements so that we can manage your affairs if you become incapacitated." Gerald nodded enthusiastically and began explaining how these arrangements would protect me from potential financial exploitation and ensure that Emma's inheritance would be maximized through proper tax planning. He made it all sound very official and legitimate, but I recognized exactly what was happening. When I asked to review the documents more carefully before making any decisions, Marcus's demeanor shifted noticeably. "Susan, we don't really have time to delay this. Gerald has arranged his schedule specifically for this meeting, and these legal structures need to be implemented soon to be effective." Gerald added pressure by mentioning filing deadlines and tax implications that would supposedly become more complicated if we waited. He pushed a power of attorney document toward me and pointed to signature lines explaining that this would simply allow Emma and Marcus to handle financial matters if needed, and wouldn't take effect unless I became unable to manage things myself. Emma, looking confused but trusting, encouraged me to listen to their advice. "Mom, they know much more about this stuff than we do. If Marcus thinks this is important for our family's security, maybe we should just take care of it today." I looked around my dining room table at these three people, two of whom were supposedly acting in my best interests, and realized that this was the moment of truth I'd been anticipating for months. Marcus and his attorney were essentially attempting to gain legal control over what they assumed were my modest financial assets, using Emma's love and concern for me as leverage to pressure me into signing documents I didn't understand. Taking a deep breath, I told them I needed time to review everything with my own attorney before making any decisions. The reaction was immediate and telling. Gerald's professional demeanor slipped as he explained urgently why delay would be costly and potentially problematic. Marcus's voice took on an edge of frustration as he talked about family responsibilities and protecting everyone's interests. But it was Emma's reaction that broke my heart. She looked genuinely confused and hurt that I wasn't accepting what she'd been convinced was generous help from her new husband. "Mom, why won't you just let Marcus help us? He's good at this kind of thing, and he's only trying to protect our family." By the end of the meeting, Gerald had packed up his unsigned documents with obvious frustration, and Marcus had made it clear that he'd be returning with more comprehensive legal options once I'd had time to think about the consequences of delaying necessary financial planning. After they left, I sat alone in my quiet house and realized that my months of silence about the $95 million inheritance had served its purpose perfectly. Marcus had revealed exactly who he was, someone willing to manipulate my daughter's love and concern, to gain control over what he thought were my assets. The only question now was whether I could help Emma see the truth before it was too late. That evening, after Marcus and Gerald had left with their unsigned documents, I made 3 phone calls that would change everything. First, I called my attorney in Boston and scheduled an emergency meeting for Monday morning. Second, I called Emma and asked her to come back to the house the next day for a private conversation that I described as extremely important. And third, I called a private investigator that my attorney had recommended, asking for a complete background check on Marcus Wellington and Gerald Thornton. Sunday morning arrived gray and rainy, matching my mood as I prepared for what I knew would be one of the most difficult conversations of my life. Emma arrived looking tired and confused, still processing the previous day's meeting, and my unexpected resistance to what she'd been told was helpful financial planning. "Mom, I don't understand what happened yesterday," Emma began as we sat in my living room with cups of coffee. "Marcus was trying to help us, and you acted like he was trying to hurt you somehow. He's worried about your future, and so am I." Taking a deep breath, I began with the truth I'd been hiding for 3 years. "Emma, there's something I need to tell you about our family's financial situation. Something I've kept secret because I was waiting for the right time, and because I wanted to see what kind of person you'd become without this knowledge influencing you." I told her about William's death and the inheritance. I explained about the 3 private islands in the Caribbean, the $95 million valuation, and the property management company that had been operating them successfully for the past 3 years. Emma's face went through a series of emotions: shock, disbelief, confusion, and finally a kind of stunned understanding. "You mean we're rich?" she asked quietly. "We've been rich this whole time, and you never told me." "Yes," I replied, "and I want you to understand why I made that choice." I explained my fears about how sudden wealth might change her, my desire to see her build her own character and work ethic without the safety net of inherited money, and my growing concerns about Marcus's motivations and behavior. I showed her the preliminary background check information that had revealed his pattern of relationships with wealthy women and his previous attempts to gain access to family assets. Emma was quiet for a long time, processing everything I'd told her. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and hurt. "Mom, how could you not trust me with this? How could you let me worry about money? Let me take out student loans, let me stress about our family's financial security when you knew we had all this wealth?" It was a fair question and one I'd anticipated. I explained that her student loans had built her credit and given her a sense of accomplishment, that her financial stress had motivated her to work harder and appreciate opportunities, and that her concern for our family's security had shown me what a caring, responsible person she'd become. "I wanted you to know who you were before you knew what you had," I told her. But then I had to address the more immediate concern. "Emma, I need you to think carefully about yesterday's meeting. Marcus and that attorney were trying to get me to sign legal documents that would have given them control over what they thought were my modest assets. If I'm right about Marcus's motivations, this conversation is about to become much more complicated. Emma's face changed as the implications of my words sank in. You think Marcus is only interested in me because he thinks our family has money. I think Marcus has been systematically trying to access what he believes are hidden family assets since he started dating you, I replied. And now that his first attempt failed, he's going to escalate his efforts. We spent the rest of the day going through the evidence I'd gathered, the background check information, the pattern of his questions about our family finances, the suspicious timing of his financial advice, and the aggressive tactics used by his attorney. Emma was devastated, but also beginning to see the situation clearly. Monday morning, Emma called in sick to work and accompanied me to Boston to meet with my attorney. By the time we returned that afternoon, we had a plan in place to protect our assets and test Marcus's true intentions. We also had a much more comprehensive background check that revealed even more disturbing information about his financial history and relationship patterns. Tuesday evening, Marcus called Emma to ask about the weekend's family financial meeting and whether I'd come to my senses about the necessary legal arrangements. Emma, following our plan, told him that I was still resistant, but that she was working on convincing me to cooperate. Marcus's response was telling. He immediately began pressuring Emma to find out more specific information about our family's hidden assets and to help him locate any additional financial documents that might be stored in our house. Wednesday night, Emma invited Marcus over for dinner at my house, ostensibly to work together on convincing me to accept his financial help. But this time Emma and I were prepared. With my attorney's guidance, we'd set up a recording device to capture the conversation, and Emma had prepared specific questions designed to reveal Marcus's true agenda. The conversation that followed was both enlightening and heartbreaking. When Emma asked Marcus directly about his previous relationships and his interest in her family's finances, he initially tried to deflect. But as she pressed harder, asking specific questions about his research into our background and his conversations with Gerald about our asset potential, Marcus's true personality emerged. He became angry and defensive, ultimately admitting that he'd done his due diligence before pursuing a serious relationship with Emma. He'd researched our family's financial history, looked into Robert's life insurance policies and employment records, and concluded that there were definitely hidden assets that I was selfishly keeping from Emma. "Every family has money somewhere," Marcus said, his voice rising with frustration. "Your mother is clearly hiding something, and it's not fair to you or to our future together. We need to find out what she's got and make sure it's properly managed for our family's benefit." When Emma asked him directly if he would have pursued their relationship, if he'd known our family had no money, Marcus's pause was answer enough, but his eventual response was even more damning. "Emma, love is important, but financial compatibility and security are the foundation of any successful marriage. I need to know that we're building a future based on solid financial ground." That night after Marcus left, Emma cried for hours in my arms. The man she'd married, the person she'd thought she'd spend her life with, had revealed himself to be someone who valued her primarily for her perceived financial potential. It was a devastating realization, but it was also the clarity we'd needed to move forward. The divorce proceedings began immediately, with Marcus's recorded admissions about his motivations and the evidence of his attempts to gain financial control through legal manipulation. Emma's attorney was confident that the process would be straightforward. Since they'd been married for less than 2 months and had no shared assets, the legal dissolution was completed within 6 weeks. But the emotional healing took much longer. Emma struggled with feelings of betrayal, embarrassment, and self-doubt. She questioned her judgment about people and worried that she'd never be able to trust anyone again. During this difficult period, I finally told her the complete truth about the Caribbean islands and suggested that we plan a trip to see them together. 6 months after her divorce was finalized, Emma and I flew to Nassau and took a charter boat to the 3 islands that comprised our unexpected inheritance. Standing on the white sand, beaches looking out at crystal-clear turquoise water, Emma finally began to understand the scope of what William had left us and the responsibility that came with such wealth. We spent a week exploring the properties, meeting with the management company, and discussing how we wanted to use this inheritance. Emma was amazed by the luxury resorts that had been built on 2 of the islands and the pristine natural habitat that had been preserved on the 3rd. We talked about our options: selling the properties, continuing to operate them as investments, or finding ways to use the wealth for philanthropic purposes. During our last evening on the main island, as we watched the sunset from the terrace of the resort's main lodge, Emma finally thanked me for keeping the secret. "Mom, you were right to wait. If I'd known about this money when I was younger, I might have made different choices. I might not have worked as hard, and I definitely wouldn't have learned to be independent. And if Marcus had known about this wealth from the beginning, I never would have seen who he really was." We decided to keep one of the smaller islands as a private family retreat and donate the proceeds from the other 2 properties to educational foundations that provide scholarships for students from low-income families. Emma wanted to ensure that other young people would have the same opportunities for education and personal growth that had shaped her character during our years of financial struggle. A year later, Emma met David, a pediatric nurse who volunteers at a free clinic in Brooklyn. Their relationship developed slowly and naturally, built on shared values and genuine compatibility rather than financial considerations. When Emma eventually told David about our family's wealth, his reaction was concern about whether the money might complicate their relationship, not excitement about potential benefits. As I write this story, Emma and David have been together for 18 months, and I've watched their relationship grow stronger through challenges that have nothing to do with money. David has never asked about our finances, never suggested investment strategies, and never shown any interest in our assets beyond wanting to understand how they've affected Emma's life and values. The experience with Marcus taught us both valuable lessons about the power of wealth to reveal people's true characters and the importance of building relationships based on genuine compatibility rather than financial considerations. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone we love is the opportunity to show us who they really are, even when that revelation is painful. My decision to stay silent about the $95 million inheritance wasn't just about protecting Emma from gold diggers like Marcus. It was about giving her the chance to become the person she was meant to be, independent of wealth or social status. It was about ensuring that when love came into her life, it would be real and lasting, built on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine affection. Looking back, I realize that keeping that secret was one of the most difficult but important decisions I've ever made as a mother. It required me to watch my daughter struggle financially when I could have easily solved her problems. It meant allowing her to worry about my future when I was actually financially secure beyond most people's dreams. But it also gave her the gift of knowing that everything she achieved was through her own efforts and abilities. The money is still there, safely managed and growing in value. But more importantly, Emma is still there too. The same caring, hardworking, genuine person she became during our years of financial struggle. She's learned that wealth is a tool that can be used wisely or unwisely, but it should never be the foundation of our identity or our relationships. Sometimes, as parents, we have to make choices that seem harsh or unfair in the moment, but serve our children's long-term interests. Sometimes, love means saying no when we could easily say yes. And sometimes the greatest act of protection is allowing someone we love to face challenges that will help them grow stronger and wiser. Have you ever had to keep a difficult secret to protect someone you loved? Have you ever discovered that someone's interest in you was motivated by financial considerations rather than genuine affection? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video if you believe that true love should be built on character rather than bank accounts. Subscribe for more stories about family relationships and the complex decisions we make to protect the people we care about most. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that sometimes the most valuable inheritance we can give our children isn't money, but the wisdom and strength they gain from overcoming challenges on their own. Until next time, trust your instincts, value genuine relationships, and never let wealth become more important than the love and respect that bind families together.